Hello, I'm Professor John Blakeman from the UW-Stevens Point Political Science Department, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture to celebrate Constitution Day, September 17th, 2020. So today's lecture is what I call a constitutional quick take on the Electoral College. So what exactly is the Electoral College? Well, it's, according to the Constitution, the way we elect the president. And it's spelled out in Article 2 of the Constitution. Article 2 sets up the office of the presidency, and it tells us specifically the way we elect the president and the vice president. And according to Article 2, the way we do it is this. Each state shall appoint, in such a manner as it sees fit, a number of electors equal to the number of the state's senators and representatives in Congress. And those electors will then meet and cast their vote for the president. Not really what you thought, huh? Well, it's a lot different than popularly electing the president. Now, fun fact, the Constitution itself doesn't use the words Electoral College. The phrase is nowhere in the constitutional document. It's a phrase that comes about when early politicians started to refer to this process as the Electoral College. And then finally, in the mid-1800s, federal law regulating how national elections are run uses the phrase Electoral College too. But the Constitution itself doesn't say anything like that. Now, here's a breakdown from 2016 of the number of electoral votes that each state has. And remember, the number of votes is based on the number of senators, always two, right? The two senators, and then the number of representatives in the House of Representatives that a state has. So a state like Wisconsin has 10 electors, 2 senators and 8 members of the House of Representatives. A very populous state like California has 55, 2 senators and 53 members of the House of Representatives. A very small state in terms of population like Wyoming, 2 senators and 1 representative. So the number of electors that a state has varies from one state to another. And it's based on a state's population and the representation that the state is entitled to in the United States Congress when we total up the number of senators and the number of representatives. So the process itself, when you vote in November for a presidential candidate, you are actually voting for what we call a slate of electors, individuals who are pledged to support that candidate. 48 out of the 50 states have what we call a winner-take-all system. So the winner of the popular vote in that state wins all of the electoral votes of that state. There are only 2 states that are different here, Maine and Nebraska. And in those 2 states, the winner of the popular vote gets the 2 Senate votes in the Electoral College, but each congressional district in Maine and Nebraska allocates its electoral vote separately. Now, after we vote in November for a slate of electors, the electors assemble, according to federal law, on the Monday after the 2nd Wednesday in December. Quite specific, isn't it? And that's when they cast their vote. And electors will almost always assemble in their state's capital. And then, also according to federal law and the Constitution, Congress counts the votes on January 6th of the next year following the election. So who gets to be an elector? Who gets to serve in this Electoral College? Well, almost all states leave it up to political parties to decide. And so typically the way a state does that, or a way a political party does that, is the party will allow its incumbent state legislators, its party officers, and sometimes even candidates who are running for office for that political party. They all meet together and they vote for the party's slate of electors who will go into the Electoral College if the party's presidential candidate is successful. Most states also require electors to vote for the presidential and vice presidential candidates that they are pledged or chosen to support. Okay, so why do we have the Electoral College? Well, In 1787, the framers of the Constitution knew they wanted an executive and they wanted a president, but they weren't quite sure how that president should be elected. Some of the framers of the Constitution wanted the president elected directly by the people. Others did not want that. Maybe they were a little distrustful of democracy, perhaps. So we have it because the framers of the Constitution ultimately compromised. They agreed. They reached an agreement on the process. And they came at that agreement from many different perspectives and many different angles. They were pretty much in agreement that the Electoral College would limit congressional influence on the choice of the executive. And the framers were quite clear as a group that they wanted to make sure that Congress would have very, very little influence over who the president actually is. Because remember, we have a system of the separation of powers. And the two politically elected branches, Congress and the presidency, should be as separate as possible. The framers also realized with the Electoral College, it gave states a role in electing the president of the United States. You know, every state has to have its own group of electors who meet within that state and vote. And so that gives the states influence. Now, you know, framers from some of the more populous states in 1787, like New York and Virginia and Pennsylvania especially, they knew that they would have more votes in this electoral college system. And so they, you know, ultimately advocated for it. It does give populous states a certain advantage, okay? But we also argue that it protects small states too. Finally, the Electoral College, as the framers saw it, it insulates the election process from political manipulation and intrigue, and it limits the popular enthusiasm for a specific candidate. It also limits what we call sectional or geographical influence too. So even though it gives states a role, it doesn't allow one or a handful of states from a specific region to dominate the process. So what happens if something goes wrong? Well, there's many different ways of looking at this. So one is where we say we have an electoral college misfire, where the winner of the national popular vote loses the electoral college vote. It's happened 4 times in our history: 1876, 1888, 2000, and then in 2016, where President Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, but President Trump won the electoral college. Another thing that can go wrong is where there's no majority or the electoral college is actually tied. And here the 12th Amendment specifies what happens next. The 12th Amendment says that when the electoral college does not return a winner, the House elects the president and the Senate elects the vice president. Under the 12th Amendment, that's only happened once in 1824. It did happen sort of in 1800 prior to the 12th Amendment. Okay, faithless electors, another place where the Electoral College can go wrong, where an elector who is pledged to one candidate turns out to vote for another candidate. Well, since 1948, out of almost 9,700 individual electoral votes cast in all those presidential elections, there have only been 16 electors who did not vote for the candidate they were pledged to support. What we call a faithless elector. Turns out it's not much of a problem. Another issue is the Decennial Census. You know, the Electoral College is based on the congressional representation that each state receives. Each state always has 2 senators, right? But remember, the representation in the House of Representatives from each state, that's going to change from one 10-year census to another. Some states, because of population shifts within the United States, some states will gain 1 or 2 representatives. Other states will lose those representatives. So one criticism here is the Electoral College is tied to the Decennial Census, and it does not account for population shifts from one census to another. So for example, an intervening election like in 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016. Those elections are based on the Electoral College as established in 2000 and then 2010. But we know the population within the United States shifts between those 10-year time frames. Okay, so why do we keep it then, if it seems like it has problems? Well, one argument is it generally works, and we live in a republic where we elect our representatives. We don't live in a pure democracy where the will of the people is directly translated into political outcomes. Out of 54 presidential elections, the Electoral College has returned a winner in 53. So that's pretty good batting average. In 49 elections, the winner of the Electoral College was also the popular vote winner. This one's a little trickier, right? That there are some elections in our history where one candidate won the popular vote, yet lost the electoral vote, and therefore was not present. Another argument for keeping it is it protects small states. It keeps small states, and by small we mean small in population, like Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, Rhode Island, Delaware. It keeps smaller states from being dominated by larger states. But why not get rid of it? Let's take counter arguments. Well, the argument goes, let's get rid of it because we live in a democracy, and indirect elections where we filter the will of the people through this small group of electors, that's undemocratic. And it tends to show that votes are weighed differently depending on where you live. So in 2016, Wyoming, 255,849 voters in Wyoming. Wyoming has 3 electoral votes, so each electoral vote is worth over 85,000 votes. Whereas in California, 14.1 million voters, 55 electoral votes, each electoral vote is worth 847,000 votes. Now, what that means is Wyoming has arguably a little more influence, or at least the electors in Wyoming have a little more influence than the electors in California because they represent fewer people. Electoral College misfires, where the Electoral College winner is not the popular vote winner. That's one of the drawbacks to it. And that's one argument about getting rid of it. And then finally, another argument is it harms small states. Individual voters in large states can wield more power and influence than voters in small states. That's the exact opposite of what I just told you, isn't it? Well, it just goes to show that you can have 2 conflicting arguments that both sort of point you in the same direction, I suppose. But let's take Florida in 2000. So President George W. Bush wins Florida by 500 votes, and he got all of Florida's 25 electoral votes. Whereas Al Gore, the Democratic candidate, won Delaware. He didn't win the presidency. He won Delaware by 43,000 votes, a huge majority over George W. Bush. And he gained all of the state's 3 electoral votes. What that tells us is a small shift in a candidate's support in a large state can negate or override the electoral vote in a small state. I'll let you all make up your own mind though, okay? Keep it, not keep it? Well, that's for you to decide. Let's look at public opinion real quick. So a Gallup poll from 2000 and 2000 and updated to 2019. If we go back almost 20 years, 60% of Americans argued that it's time to amend the Constitution and effectively get rid of the Electoral College. That has changed a little bit, as you'll see. I mean, if you look at the 2016 election, the electorate is split right down the middle, with 49% arguing that we should amend the Constitution, 47% arguing no, keep it the way it is. And that changes slightly up to 2019. But we could argue, at least for the past 20 years, that there's been a relatively consistent trend in public opinion to change the Electoral College. What we do know, according to the Gallup poll from 2019, is that it really does matter what your political background is. So among Democrats and Democratic leaners, people who lean towards the Democratic Party, 84% say amend the Constitution, get rid of the Electoral College. Among Republicans and Republican leaners, only 24% say amend the Constitution and get rid of the Electoral College. So your partisan background matters in how you see this issue. And of course, depending on how the Electoral College works out in any given election, it's going to affect the partisan view of the Electoral College itself. Okay, so that's a constitutional quick take on the Electoral College. It's pretty complex, but there you have it. Now, don't forget, there is a big election coming up this November 2020. So election day is on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020. If you have questions about your eligibility to vote or your voter registration and you are a Wisconsin citizen, go to myvote.wi.gov and don't forget to vote.